So I did a presentation on Sunday about my trip to Montgomery. So I started off the presentation by saying that I can remember when I was in grade school hearing about the Civil War and thinking to myself, so these southern states didn't want to stay in the Union. Why isn't it okay for them to make that decision? I don't think we got a lot of information about Reconstruction or about what slavery was like. I can remember watching the series Roots and being really impacted by that. But sitting in school and thinking, well, if the southern states didn't want to belong to the Union, isn't it their right to choose to leave? And I didn't voice that question. And I think it was kind of in the back of my head for a long time, anytime I heard about the Civil War, that I kind of felt ambivalent about it in terms of whether it was right or not. And it was only recently that I began to think to myself, well, South Carolina didn't want to be a part of the Union. Well, actually, there was no democratic process in South Carolina. The state was ruled by a minority. The African Americans in South Carolina were a significant number of people who were completely disenfranchised and had no rights whatsoever. So the idea that South Carolina wanted to secede is really not true, because South Carolina was not a democratic society where you could know what the will of the people was. Women were not voting. And I talked about how I remember having a conversation with our friend Dick Case, who said that he was reading something about the Lincoln-Douglas debates and how Lincoln and Douglas traveled all across the state of Illinois, and it was all across the country that people were reading and following the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And slavery was a big issue during those debates, and so people really were tuning in and interested in it, tuning in newspapers and print. And Dick Case said, those people who were showing up for those debates, they couldn't vote in the election for senator because the Constitution didn't provide for the direct election of senators. It's kind of ironic, and it's a reminder that southern states seceding was not southern states in the sense that there was no popular vote, there was no petition drive that said how many people in our state want to stay in the Union and leave the Union, how many people in our state want to continue the practice of slavery, when not any of the African American members were allowed to have any voice or any rights in terms of their bodily protection or anything else, their independence to make decisions for themselves. Women had no legal standing, no legal rights. So it's not proper to say the southern states wanted to secede when it was in fact a minority, that not even all of the white people, not all of the white men had a voice to vote. It was a society that was ruled by a minority. So I think that's an important way of framing our understanding of American history that's not always appreciated. So let me show you some pictures from my trip to Montgomery. So here's a good place to start. The airport says, "Welcome to Montgomery." And on the right there you see an advertisement. The advertisement is for the Civil Rights Memorial Center. So I'll show you some pictures from the Civil Rights Memorial. And the quote there says, "One day the South will recognize its real heroes." So I feel like as I was traveling around Montgomery, I saw a city that was divided about who its heroes were. That there's kind of two competing sets of history that don't quite align and haven't been reconciled with each other. Outside there were no taxis. Montgomery is a pretty small, quiet town. This to me is kind of the takeaway. From 1783, at the end of the American Revolution, to 1861, the number of enslaved black people in America increased 5 times over, creating extraordinary wealth for the new nation. So I feel like that's kind of a main takeaway. Also note that it's referring to enslaved black people. That's kind of a recent thing to me as an old person, to say enslaved people instead of saying slaves. And it makes so much sense to not just refer to people as slaves, because if they're slaves, then what's wrong with them being kept in slavery? It's so much better to refer to people as enslaved people. to kind of humanize them and realize that it's a situation that they find themselves in. It's not a condition of, or a character or a description of them as people. But what this describes is that at the end of the American Revolution, people were talking about liberty. And there was conversation about, well, how can we have slavery in a country that's founded on liberty? And the response to that was to say, well, slavery is not going to stay around. It's going to die out. It's not very vital. I'm going to release my slaves when I die. You know, there was all this gaslighting, really, that slavery was not a big deal. It wasn't going to be a big deal in this new nation. When actually the exact opposite happened, that slavery became much more expansive. It became more integrated in the economy. It became larger, and it became more cruel and more forceful. So sometimes people refer to the first slavery and the second slavery. So that America, with its independence, with its newfound freedom, became a more cruel, harsh place for African Americans, people of African descent. The number of enslaved Black people in America increased 5 times over. It expanded exponentially. The other thing, so there's a few things that are involved with this second slavery. One is the Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana Purchase is directly responsible for bringing Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and a whole bunch of states. It massively increased the size of the United States. And it meant that there was a need for labor to clear land, to start new plantations, new communities. It meant that we needed to expand into area where, of course, Native people were already residing, that was occupied. So aside from military being used to push them out and other methods of pushing them out, the white people wanted to bring with them laborers who would clear the land and start a whole new states and whole new communities and whole new cities. So there was this massive need for labor, this opportunity to expand slavery. The other thing that happened was that the United States decided that it would end the international slave trade, that the United States would no longer allow slavery, the slave trade in terms of internationally bringing people in, but would still allow slavery within the United States and would still allow slave trade within the United States. So there's this way in which the United States would claim some moral victory by saying we're no longer going to import people to be slaves for us. And what the result of that was is that people in Virginia and the Carolinas suddenly had this huge opportunity to sell enslaved people south. So there was a massive migration, tens of thousands of people who were put in chains and marched south. And that created wealth for the people who were selling them off. So the domestic slave trade became massive. So these are some of the things that created this condition. Also, the mechanization of industry, the cotton gin, created this massive demand for cotton. Cotton was being exported to England. England was setting up a textile industry. England was selling cheap textiles around the world. It became a massive form of wealth creation for England. The United States had a massive opportunity to provide that cotton. So there was this mechanization of the textile industry, the mechanization of the cotton gin to process the cotton, but it still needed to be manually picked. So there was an increased demand that kept stepping up, that there was more and more demand on the enslaved people to harvest more cotton. And if you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, you see how there was this daily weighing in at the end of the day to see the quota that was required from each person who was in the fields picking cotton, and how the quota would just be constantly ratcheted up and increased, and it would become more and more increasingly brutal to force people to pick more, to pick faster. So those are some of the things that come together to create this second slavery that I think not a lot is known about. There's a book called The Half Has Not Been Told by Edward Baptiste that talks about how the American economy was shaped by slavery, and gives a lot of information about the cotton trade and how cotton was king during that early period of American history. So that's how this becomes my takeaway. This is from the Legacy Museum. That after the American Revolution, slavery, the number of enslaved black people in America increased 5 times over. And that was a massive amount of wealth transfer that happened as a result of that. During the last number of years, we've seen a number of communities that have created Black Lives Matter murals. So you can see this one was created in a prominent place in Montgomery in 2020. So it references the years 1619, the year when Africans were brought to the United States against their will. 1865, the end of the Civil War, when the slave owners in the South were defeated, and 2020, when this mural was created, when there was a massive movement for Black Lives Matter across the United States. If you can see this figure right here, it looks like a person standing on the street corner. That is the Rosa Parks statue. It's life-size, so at this distance it seems merely like a person standing there. This is the location where Rosa Parks got on the bus that day and was told that she had to move because as more white people get on, the black people had to give up more and more seats. There was a way in which segregated buses said the black people had to sit in one section and the white people had to sit in another section, but it was not even consistently enforced that black people were not allowed to keep their seats in the back if more white people got on. So at the beginning of the boycott to end bus desegregation, the demand was that there be a more reasonable enforcement of the rule. It wasn't even to completely end segregation. So Rosa Parks, not sitting at the very front of the bus, was required to give up her seat as more white people got on and refused. This is Dexter Avenue, so we'll talk more about Dexter Avenue. And this is the Capitol building. Montgomery is the capital of the state of Montgomery, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. There is also in the United States, of course, a reaction against Black Lives Matter. And this is an example of the way in which there are two Montgomerys. There's a Montgomery that believes in Black Lives Matter, and there's a Montgomery that says that they don't believe in Black Lives Matter, that they don't accept that premise, and that they misrepresent it as saying that only Black Lives Matter, when that's not, of course, what it's saying. This is talking about the police, supporting the police. So I kind of feel like it's great to support the police. It's great to support our municipal workers, our first responders. But this is kind of a direct response to the Black Lives Matter movement, which is protesting police brutality. Back the blue. All across the United States, these massive demonstrations against police brutality, against the murder of Black men, women, and children by police. It says, fight for America. And that's, defining America in a way that is not inclusive, I think. This flag, this black and white flag with the blue stripe in the middle, to me is the Blue Lives Matter flag. I'm not sure how many people would give it that label, but to me, that seems like it's pretty clearly aligned with Blue Lives Matter. And it's also a flag that was carried to the Capitol on January 6th when people stormed into the Capitol and beat the police and pushed past them and broke the lines of the police protecting the Capitol. So I feel like this is kind of the anti-Black Lives Matter representation. This is a mural that talks about some of the violence that's happened, some of the abuse by police in Montgomery, representing 2 young men who were killed by police in Montgomery. This was created during the pandemic, during the time of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. This is the larger mural. So you can see there was a young man who was killed in 2016, and they're also remembering someone who was killed in 1975. This is apparently the office, the headquarters of the Equal Justice Initiative. So the Equal Justice Initiative is founded by Bryan Stevenson. Bryan Stevenson, the author of Just Mercy. Bryan Stevenson moved to Alabama because people on death row were not giving enough representation. So he created this organization, this nonprofit, the Equal Justice Initiative, to provide representation for people on death row. He has now created the Legacy Museum to explain to people the experience of people of African descent in this country. And he's created the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is a memorial to lynching. So this was a bit of a pilgrimage for me to go to see Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church was the church where Martin Luther King was pastor. At the time, an unknown young pastor coming to a new city. He became the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was the leadership for the bus boycott, which lasted almost a year. When I got to the Legacy Museum, I saw this among the many people who were recognized there. Vernon Johns. Vernon Johns was the pastor immediately before Martin Luther King at what is now Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church. So Vernon John, just before Dr. King, talked about resisting segregation, talked about the fact that they should not use the buses if the buses are segregated, that people should not go to movie theaters that are segregated. And he was kind of a lonely voice, just kind of decrying segregation, but there was no movement, no organization behind him. So King Memorial Church, Dexter Avenue King Memorial Church, was founded in 1877. They built this building in 1885. So this means that the people of African descent, the former slaves of Montgomery, within 10 years had begun to build churches and build schools and build businesses to create a real sense of community. You could not live in Alabama if you were a free Black person. Free Black people were not allowed in the state. The only people of African descent in the state were slaves. So that means that the community of Montgomery, they were all former slaves who managed to organize and to build a community in pretty quick order. And then, of course, that period of Reconstruction, when their rights were recognized and protected by the federal government, ended just about 1877. And then all those gains were pushed back. And we know things like the incident in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where whole communities, whole businesses by African Americans were attacked and destroyed. So this is Dexter Avenue King Memorial Church. This is where it's located, on Dexter Avenue, at the top of Dexter Avenue. So this is the state capitol on the left. So you can see that Dexter Avenue is a prominent piece of real estate, being right at the top of Dexter Avenue, right at the seat of the state government. And that's probably because the members of Dexter Avenue, the African American members who formed Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, were prominent. They were middle class. So they were former slaves, or they were people who were the children of slaves or the grandchildren of slaves, but they were teachers and they were professionals and they were business people. So Dexter Avenue kind of had a representation of being a prominent church for prominent people in the community. When Vernon Johns came and started talking about how they needed to fight against the rules and the laws of the city in terms of segregation, these were prominent, comfortable people. So that's another reason maybe why his message was not well received there. So this is the Civil Rights Memorial. We saw the advertisement for this back at the airport. It is a wall that is a water feature with water running down it. And it has a quote from Dr. King, "Until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." You can see the water also pouring off the table there. And a little note that that quote from Dr. King is him quoting the prophet Amos. This is the designer of the memorial, Maya Lin, who is also famous for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., which was such an amazing innovation in terms of how memorials could work and how they could function, how they could be designed to have a specific function. So this is 1989. Over 6,000 people, many veterans of the movement, gathered to celebrate the unveiling of the Civil Rights Memorial. And this is Maya Lin standing just above them at the top of the wall. And this is where the memorial is located, and the building houses the Memorial Center. Maya Lin designed this as something that people could approach and interact with, just like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial that people walk up to. They touch the names. Sometimes they make a rubbing, putting paper on the wall to make a rubbing to keep the name on a piece of paper. So people are just intuitively drawn to this table. Maya Lin talks about how on that dedication day, people who came forward with their tears remembering the martyrs who are listed on this table, so that the table represents the tears, as you see the water dripping off the edges. The wall behind it represents the future, as the water coming down as righteousness and justice, and the table representing the past because it has a list of the names of martyrs. This is inside the Civil Rights Memorial Center. There's a lot of educational information presented in this multimedia fashion. So the water wheel, she talks about the fact that she immediately wanted it to be about water, and about the wall being the past, and about the table being the future, and how water connects the two. She talks about what the table presents. That table has the sacrifice of 41 martyrs who gave their lives for the civil rights movement. The list was compiled by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Those included meet at least one of three requirements. They were targeted for their work in the movement. They were killed to terrorize and slow the movement, and their deeds inspired others to join the movement. And here she talks about the tears falling onto the table, and the table functioning in that way. The timeline goes around in a circle, and then it doesn't end. There's a gap, which is the opening for the work to continue. It ends with Dr. King being assassinated as kind of the end of the civil rights movement, of that period of that civil rights movement, but then leaves an opening for the people who went forward from there. This is Maya Lin working on the memorial. Inside the memorial is a lot of very current events depicted. So here you see the environmental movement, you see the gay rights movement, you see the Black Lives Matter movement, you see protests to end child detention at the border. So it's not just a memorial to the past, it is also looking very much as the civil rights movement, the human rights movement, as something going forward. It has depictions of Black Lives Matter protesters, get in good trouble, the famous quote from John Lewis, who just died recently, and a depiction of Amanda Gorman, who just spoke at the presidential inauguration. She was the poet who spoke at the inauguration just 2 years ago, a year ago. This is looking down from above. So when you get to this Capitol building for the state of Montgomery, there's a very prominent monument out front to Jefferson Davis. So of course, all around the country, monuments remembering the leaders of the secessionist movement, the leaders of the racist movement to continue slavery in the United States. Statues and memorials all around the country are being taken down, saying that we shouldn't be celebrating those people, and as if we support what they stood for and what they worked for. But in Montgomery, they continue to have this statue there. And again, that reminds me of the quote by Dr. King that I saw at the airport that says, "One day the South will recognize its real heroes." This is not a real hero of the South or of the United States. It's a hero of people in the South, a minority of people who want to subjugate others, who want to deny freedom to others, who believe that violence should be used to advance the cause of slavery, minority rule. So that was kind of shocking to me to see that statue there at the state capitol. Montgomery is actually the 5th city to serve as the capital for Montgomery. And here's a And so this is what you see when you approach the Capitol. Statue for Jefferson Davis. It has the states that joined the Confederate States around the bottom pedestal. This refers to Jefferson Davis as soldier, scholar, and statesman. So this is a plaque that was provided by the Equal Justice Initiative, talking about the domestic slave trade. And again, it talks about the way in which the domestic slave trade was kind of the second slavery, forcibly transferred hundreds of thousands of enslaved people from the upper South to Alabama and the lower South between 1808, when the international slave trade was ended, and 1860. So before I showed you this statue of Rosa Parks, here it is close up. It's life size. Over her shoulder is the state capitol, and just to the other side is Dexter Avenue. This is looking up the middle of Dexter Avenue. If people saw the movie Selma, or if people know about the march from Selma to Montgomery, those marchers who marched for several days to get to the state's capital in their protest, they came up this street and gathered at the state capitol. This is just stepping back and seeing the fountain. This fountain stands on the location that had been the auction block, that had been the market for people to be sold into slavery. It was a market for livestock and for all kinds of things that were considered to be property. And they considered people brought from Africa, people who were descendants of people brought from Africa in the domestic slave trade, they considered them to be property and not people. And they were sold at this location, which is now replaced with this beautiful statue. This is Court Square. So this is the Winter Building. So this is a point to remember that at the beginning of the war between the southern slave owners and the United States, that the capital that they created for the country that they were declared was Montgomery. Later it would become Richmond, but at the beginning of the war, the capital was in Montgomery. This building housed the telegraph office, and the order to start the hostilities that began the open war between the southern slave owners and the Union, that was begun by a telegram that was sent from Montgomery to Charleston, where the battle to take Fort Sumter away from the federal government on the part of these rebels. That telegram was sent from this building. The Rosa Parks statue is right across the street from this Winter Building. So there is this way in which there is this constant contrast between the heroes of one side of people in Montgomery and the heroes on another side of the people of Montgomery as across the United States. So we have this contrast, the beginning of the Civil War, the hostilities beginning from this building, and the beginning of the movement to desegregate buses in Alabama and to really advance the cause of desegregation across the South began by this woman when she, at this location, boarded a bus. This is her looking at the fountain, which, as I mentioned, had been the place where slaves, enslaved people were auctioned off in the domestic slave trade. Here's the flag of the city of Montgomery. So just to point out a couple locations, number one is Dr. King's Church. Number two is the Bicentennial Memorial. That's a whole semicircle in around the front of the state capitol. If you see that walkway there, there's this whole series of memorials that depict the history of Alabama. Number three is where the statue of Jefferson Davis is. Number four are two other statues that I'll show you later. Number five is a huge memorial, which you can actually see the top of it there, to the soldiers who died fighting for the South. And 6 and 7 are two memorials that I will show you right at the base of this part of the last block here. This is the Rosa Parks Library and Museum. You walk through the museum to learn about the period of the bus boycotts. So here are children inside the museum, and they're sitting just next to this bus here. Inside the bus are video screens, so they're watching a film that's describing the events of that day. In the middle here is an actress who is, or an actor who represents Rosa Parks, and you're listening to her as the bus driver gets up and yells at her to move her seat, and then the police officers come on. So I thought this was a really creative way of having this bus here for children and others to get a sense that they're witnessing what happened on that day. And this is just looking down Dexter Avenue. You can see where Dr. King's Church is, Dexter Avenue, King Memorial Baptist Church, in relation to the statue of Jefferson Davis that looks down the avenue. This is the bus station that Freedom Riders arrived at, and they were set upon and they were beaten, and the police did not intervene on their behalf. Today it is a museum to the Freedom Riders who wanted to challenge segregation on interstate busing. So they traveled across the South, and in some instances they were protected, but in many instances they were not protected, and organized attacks were waiting for them. And this marker tells you that it was in 1961 when a group of black and white student nonviolent coordinating committee members led by John Lewis left Birmingham, bound for Montgomery on the bus. They were determined to continue the freedom ride from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans that had met with violence in Birmingham. Their purpose was to test a court case, Morton versus Virginia, declaring segregation in bus terminals unconstitutional. Upon arriving in Montgomery, their police escort disappeared, and an angry mob of over 200 Klan supporters attacked and injured them at the Greyhound terminal. So I spent about a day and a half in Montgomery. So I quickly tried to visit as many things that I could, mostly by walking. I thought that this marker was interesting because if you wanted to go to the Civil Rights Memorial and Center, you'd go to the right. But if you wanted to go to see the first White House of the Confederacy, you'd go to the left. So again, there are these competing histories, one that glorifies the Confederate States, and one that reminds us about the sacrifices made by civil rights marchers and protesters. So I mentioned that there's a ring of monuments in front of the state capitol that were put up to remember the history of the state of Alabama at its bicentennial. So I'm sorry that this is sideways. It's just telling you that this bicentennial park was created in 2019. So opposite the side where Jefferson Davis stands is a smaller monument. And this is a monument to a doctor who is referred to as the father of modern gynecology, James Marion Sims. So he's referred to as the father of modern gynecology, but he was someone who should not be honored in our society. Indeed, there was a statue of him in Manhattan that people began to protest, and it was eventually taken down. He developed his understanding of gynecology through the use of enslaved women, experimenting on these enslaved women in the 1840s. He performed experimental surgery on at least 12 subjects, attempting to perfect the methods that he was trying to develop. The statue in Central Park was removed in 2018 after multiple calls for its removal, after its history of mutilation of Black women was unearthed. Next to the statue is a statue of another doctor, Dr. Wythe. And he's honored as a Confederate soldier, surgeon, and author. So these three statues celebrate the resistance to the advancement of democracy and liberty, and honor and glorify the people who were responsible for the rebellion and who were responsible for the worst misdeeds of the mistreatment of African Americans in this country. Just to the side of the state capitol, you can see the state capitol there. This is right next to it, is this massive monument to those people who fought in the rebellion against the Union. And we see here that the cornerstone for it was laid by Jefferson Davis in 1886. So that's quite a while after the Civil War that he was still being honored and treated as a prestigious person in this community. So this is one of those historical markers that shows the other side of the history, not the glorification of the rebellion. All of these markers are within like the past 10 years or so. So this one celebrates the Selma to Montgomery March. It ended there at the state capitol in 1965 when 25,000 civil rights marchers arrived to demand the right to vote for African Americans. That was the culmination of a series of demonstrations that began in Selma with Bloody Sunday, when some 600 peaceful protesters were savagely beaten, and when people across the United States watched that happening live on television. I saw only two references to the people who lived in Montgomery before it was taken over by the United States, the indigenous people, the native people, and this was one of them. It doesn't really tell you a lot about the people who lived there. Just tells you that by the 1500s, war and disease introduced by Europeans had devastated the native population. So there's not a lot to recognize the first people who lived in this area. So again, I just made this to show the relationship of a certain number of things. Dr. King's Church, Dexter Avenue King Memorial Church. And now I want to show you the objects 6 and 7 on this map. So this is number 6. It's a marker to the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March. Having a quote from Dr. King, "I believe this march will go down as one of the greatest struggles for freedom and dignity in the nation's history." You can see how this is just in front of the state capitol. When you cross the street, you see this marker. It's telling you that Dexter Avenue is named after one of the founders of Montgomery. And then it tells you that along this street moved the inaugural parade of Jefferson Davis when he took the oath of office as president of the so-called Confederate States of America in 1861, and that Dixie was played as a band arrangement for the first time on that occasion. This marker was put up in 1942. So again, an example of how they've decided not to correct their glorification of these events, but rather just put an alternative understanding of the history alongside of it. So this is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which I talked about was created by Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative. So this has a memorial to lynchings. It gives you a history of lynchings during the period after the Civil War, during the period called Reconstruction, which was then followed by the period of Jim Crow. So among the displays they have there They've been researching locations of lynchings that happened across the United States in the years after the Civil War, after Reconstruction. And what they've been doing is they've been collecting dirt from those locations to put them on display at the memorial. This one being from a lynching that happened in 1930, and the person's name was not able to be found. This is dirt from another location where a man, his wife, and his 2 children were lynched in Alabama in 1900. So the main part of the memorial is these steel monuments, which are suspended from the ceiling. When you're outside of the memorial, you see these identical steel monuments laying on the ground, so you can kind of walk up to them and see them easier. These are intended to be sent, if they're able to be received, by the locations where the lynchings happened across the United States. So this is the web page for the Equal Justice Initiative. And on the right here, you see more of those canisters on display there at the memorial. So what the Equal Justice Initiative has done is given 2 things: a legacy museum and then the Memorial to Peace and Justice. So this is a little taste of what the Legacy Museum is about, giving a really comprehensive overview of the history of the treatment of African Americans.
Black people came to this country after being abducted, kidnapped, and trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean in horrific conditions of confinement. The arrival of chained Africans in 1619 was followed by 2.5 centuries of bondage, violence, degradation, and abusive enslavement. White enslavers created false myths about Black people to justify slavery. Black people were defined as less human, less evolved, less capable, and less worthy of respect. Despite these false ideas of racial difference, enslaved Black people cultivated strategies for survival, fought for freedom, and held on to their dignity and humanity despite the hardships and suffering. When emancipation finally came in 1865, formerly enslaved Black Americans could have sought revenge and retribution against those who had abused them. Instead, most committed themselves to peace, to community, to citizenship, and to a new America. Many Black survivors of slavery were so committed to family that they spent their last resources to find their children, siblings, spouses, and loved ones who had been sold away. By 1867, 80% of Black men had registered to vote. Many ran for office and accepted leadership positions in their community. Education became a priority in the Black community, and Black schools created a generation of skilled citizens who could help the nation grow. But many white leaders were violently resistant to these aspirations for racial equality and citizenship. White mobs attacked Black people and used lynching, violence, and racial terror to prevent Black progress. Congress abandoned Reconstruction in 1877, and the United States Supreme Court sided with former Confederates and white Southerners who declared states' rights to disenfranchise Black people, restore racial hierarchy, and subordinate Black communities. As former New York Governor Horatio Seymour announced, "This is a white man's country, let white men rule." For a century, racial terror lynchings, racist laws, and Jim Crow practices oppressed Black people. When millions fled violence and abuse in the South and moved to the North and West, they faced less risk of mob violence, but continued to see discrimination and bigotry. A heroic civil rights movement emerged in the 1950s and 1960s, led by courageous Black people committed to community and nonviolence. These extraordinary people were beaten and battered. Some were killed, but they dismantled legal apartheid, racial segregation, and legally sanctioned racial hierarchy. While much progress was made, racial discrimination continued, and Black people remained burdened by a destructive presumption of guilt and dangerousness. A new era of mass incarceration emerged. More prisons, more police, and more punishment shaped the end of the 20th century. Today, the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Racial bias is pervasive in the criminal legal system, and the government has projected that 1 in 3 Black male babies born is expected to spend time in jail or prison. Long-standing barriers to economic progress, healthcare, and stable housing have been exacerbated by an epidemic of police violence against unarmed Black people whose quality of life is measurably disadvantaged and distinct from other Americans. The legacy of slavery and racial injustice still creates barriers to just treatment for some, fosters inequality, and fuels racial animus and bigotry. EJI believes a new era of truth and justice is required that compels our nation to reckon with our history. We believe that truth can set us free and lead to healing, redemption, recovery, and repair. The Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice are dedicated to these goals. These institutions have a purpose. Our hope, our vision, is that the children of our children will live in a nation unburdened by the legacy of slavery, free from racial bigotry and injustice. We hope you'll visit us and join the effort to promote truth and justice in America.
So that's Brian Stevenson giving us an overview of the history of African Americans in the United States. This shows you the National Memorial to Peace and Justice. Each of these steel monuments represents a commemoration, remembrance of lynchings that happened. They're organized by county, so there'll be a number of names sometimes on individual monuments, adding up to some 4,000 people in terms of those incidents that were able to be researched and to be recorded. And then there are about 800 of these individual monuments. So that's some of what you can find on the Eco Justice Initiative website. Lots of videos and lots of information about what they have down there in Alabama. This is an example of one of the monuments. It is organized by county, and then it'll give you a list of any of the people that they have been able to research and find who were lynched in that county. This is one for Nebraska. I gave a sermon on a recent Sunday about the lynching of Will Brown in Nebraska. You can see that there are places way outside of the southern United States, including New York, Pennsylvania. In the Legacy Museum, you're told that you're standing on ground where these incidents, where this history took place. This is the Legacy Museum. So I want to thank you for watching this, and I want to ask you to continue to try to learn and to explore more about this history. There's some books that you can read. I told you that it was kind of a pilgrimage for me to go to the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. I learned about that church and its history from this book by Taylor Branch. This is one of 3 that he writes in a trilogy about the Civil Rights era. And this begins by telling you a lot about the background, including the story about Vernon Johns. If you haven't seen the 1619 Project, this has a number of essays. It's organized by Nicole Hannah-Jones, but there's dozens of essays by different authors covering the 400-year history of Africans and African Americans in the United States. Learning about the significance of cotton and Alabama is The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptiste, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. This is a book that's come out fairly recently by Isabel Wilkerson, talking about how to understand the intersections of race and class, and looking at comparisons between the caste system in India, the oppression that happened in Nazi Germany, and the history of racism and racial segregation and white supremacy in the United States. There are many other books, including Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. So thank you for your time, and I hope the conversation can continue.